Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Discovery of a New Nation, Native Americans and the Beginning of the United States. My name is Cachette Roman. I'm a reference librarian and the head of adult programming at the Irvington Public Library. With us today is Heather Bruegl, my apologies if I've mispronounced your last name, who's going to speak to us today about the history of the United States in relation to the native peoples of this continent and the history of the native peoples of this continent in relation to the United States. Do I have that all right, Heather?
Yes.
All right. I'm going to let you introduce yourself and take over. I'm going to set you as the spotlight video and mute myself. If anyone has any questions or comments, please feel free to use the chat. We do ask that people do not use voice chat to comment or ask questions unless the speaker has specifically asked for that or if we're in a Q&A portion. And we're going to switch things over to Heather. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me here today. I am super excited to be able to bring you this lecture. Even though it's virtually, I'm still love that I'm able to do this. My name is Heather Bruegl. I'm an enrolled citizen of Oneida Nation of Wisconsin, first-line descendant, Stockbridge-Munsee. I currently act as the Director of Cultural Affairs for the Stockbridge-Munsee community, but first and foremost, I am a historian and lecturer. And so I have developed a series of lectures. This is actually the first in a series. There's actually two more lectures. I talk about Native history, the importance of policy and activism within the Native community, and lots of issues that happen in our community as well. And so I'm very excited to be able to be coming to you from where my home sits is on the ancestral homelands of the Menominee Nation, who resided on 10 million acres in the state of Wisconsin and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. So I'm very honored to be coming to you from their whole ancestral homelands and to honor their ancestors past and present and to work to create a more equitable and inclusive space for all. Also, on a side note, since I am coming to you from home, I do have 3 dogs who are all napping right now, but they might, if they bark, that's what the noise is. It's 3 dogs, and hopefully they're not going to be barking. So I'm really excited to talk to you because we're going to talk about, a lot of people think Native history started 1492 when Columbus came. We started way before that. And so this particular talk is going to start at the very beginnings in the 1100s with the Iroquois Confederacy, and we're going to go all the way just to the start of the Civil War. So we're going to cover a lot of information in a short amount of time, and touching on some pieces of history that you may not have gotten in school or may not have heard about, or you didn't know a lot about. And so I'm really excited to talk to you about this today. Any questions, as they stated earlier, please just put them in the chat box at the end, and we'll discuss them at the end. And if there aren't any questions that you can think of, my contact information is available, and so I'm willing to answer questions that way as well. So we'll just get started here. So the Iroquois Confederacy, known as the People of the Longhouse, believed to have been founded by the Great Peacemaker in 1142. It's said that this happened after a great solar eclipse. The Confederacy was formed by both men and women. There was equal footing. Women were not thought of less than. They were right there and helping forming of the government. The Great Law of Peace was written on wampum belts and was handed down by the Great Peacemaker, and it was spoken by Hiawatha. And an example of the belt is on the screen here, and that's that bluish purple photo at the top. The original Confederacy was referred to as the Five Nations, and it consisted of the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca. In 1722, that's when the Tuscarora, who migrated from the south, migrated up, and they joined the Confederacy. For nearly 200 years, the Confederacy was powerful in policymaking, and aligning yourself with them offered advantages to the European colonies. The Confederacy remained very independent, though. They kind of did their own thing. The Confederacy was also matrilineal, which means it followed the bloodline of the mother. And it was like I said, women were at equal footing with the men. One wasn't above the other. This was something that wasn't understood by the French and the British, and the concept of the traditional gender norms that we see today actually were from colonization. So the matrilineal line is really how we started here. The clan mothers had great power, and this was hard for the Europeans to understand. Women could appoint you into being chief. They could also take you out of that position as well. And there were also various women's councils that had a great say in what was being done in the community. During the French and Indian War, the Confederacy remained mostly neutral, but were really good at playing the French and the British off of each other in order to determine who would get them the best goods. In 1783, the Iroquois Confederacy formally disbanded. The U.S. signed treaties with the Tuscarora and the Oneida, and those remaining in New York were forced to live within territorial lands. The Tuscarora and the Oneida helped the U.S. during the Revolutionary War, and they were given much larger tracts of land and money and education for the construction of a sawmill. The Mohawks signed an agreement or a treaty with the British, and they received a land grant in Canada, and they formed their own sense of Iroquois Confederacy. And we'll talk a little bit more about their role in the American Revolution as we get more towards that part in history. So now we move to Roanoke and the Lost Colony, and this is actually one of the most interesting things that I find in this early history, living for a short time in North Carolina when I was super young, I believe I was in elementary school, and hearing about the Lost Colony was really interesting. So Roanoke, it was also known as the Lost Colony, but this was the first attempt at a permanent settlement, a permanent British colony in the New World. It was established in 1585 on Roanoke Island in what is present-day Dare County, North Carolina. On March 25th, 1584, Queen Elizabeth I granted a charter to Sir Walter Raleigh to begin colonizing the New World. The group explored the land and came into contact with different Native American tribes in the area, including the Croatan tribe. Not everything was rosy, and at one point the settlers accused the natives of stealing a silver cup, and in retaliation there was a fire set to their village, so there was a lot of back and forth. Despite of all that was going on, Sir Richard Greenville decided to leave the colony, promising to return in April of 1586 with more men and fresh supplies. But April of 1586 came and went, and there was no return of Greenville. Then in June of 1586, there was an attack on the fort at Roanoke by the local native tribes. Shortly after this attack, Sir Francis Drake, on his way back from a successful trip to the Caribbean, he stopped by the colony on his way back to England and offered to take the colonists back. Several accepted the offer, and that is when they took some of their crops back to England and introduced tobacco to the English, corn, and potatoes. Greenville arrived back at the colony shortly after Drake left and gathered most of his men and headed back to England. He left about 15 men behind to continue to have a British presence in North America. In 1587, Raleigh dispatched a brand new group of colonists, around 115, to settle in the Chesapeake Bay area. Led by John White, once the group arrived, they were ordered to go over to Roanoke and bring back the people that were there. Once at the settlement, they didn't find anything. Simon Fernandez, who was the lead navigator on this trip, refused to let the colonists leave and was determined to start a colony at Roanoke. John White reestablished relations with the Croatan tribe. The colony was also running low on supplies, so the colonists persuaded White to return to England to gather more supplies, ask for help, and then to come back. He left behind 115 colonists, plus his new granddaughter, Virginia Dare, who was the first English-born child in America. White left for England in late 1587, with plans to return were delayed because the captain refused to leave in the winter, and then the attack on the Spanish Armada happened, and every available British ship was needed. And because of the mounting war with Spain, White was unable to head back to the New World for an additional 3 years. He finally made it back to the colony and landed on August 18th, 1590, his granddaughter's 3rd birthday. But the settlement was deserted. There was no sign of the 115 colonists, and also no sign of any struggle or battle. The word Croatan was carved in a fence post around the village. The homes were dismantled, which meant the people did not leave in a hurry because it takes time to dismantle those homes. Before White had originally left, he instructed the colony to carve a Maltese cross into a tree if their absence had been forced. There was no such cross found. With the word Croatan carved into the tree, White took it as that the colony had moved to Croatan Island, now Hatteras Island. But there was a storm coming, and the men refused to search anymore, and the next day they left without finding out whatever happened to these colonists. It wasn't until 12 years later that Sir Walter Raleigh decided to investigate what happened to his colonists. In 1602, Raleigh and a new crew headed for North Carolina, but Raleigh also wanted to make money on this voyage, and by the time he and his men were done gathering plants that they could sell, the weather had turned bad and they had to leave. In 1603, there was one final expedition to find out what happened to the colony, this time led by Bartholomew Gilbert, since Raleigh was already imprisoned by this time for treason. Their intended destination was the Chesapeake Bay, but bad weather forced them to land elsewhere. But once they were just beginning the search, Gilbert and his group were killed. It was said that in 1607 that John Smith had learned that Chief Powhatan was responsible for the slaughter of the colony at Roanoke. This was also confirmed by a second source who was at the Jamestown colony as the secretary. His reports claimed that the colony had been living peacefully with the natives just outside of Powhatan's territory for more than 20 years before they were slaughtered. These reports provided the traditional view that the colony was slaughtered. However, there's never been any evidence found to say that. Plus, upon further examination, the slaughter may have been actually of the 15 original colonists, not the 115 left behind in the second colony. To this day, in 2020, no one's been able to find out what happened to the Lost Colony. There have been theories, but there hasn't been any actual evidence that swings it either way. So again, in 2020, we still have no idea what happened to this colony. It's still very fascinating, and there have been numerous documentaries and things done to try to find out what happened to this lost colony. So then we move to the founding of Jamestown, which is extremely important. This was the first permanent English settlement in the New World. Landfall was made on April 26, 1607, near the Powhatan River, which was later renamed the James River in honor of King James. Edward Wingfield was elected president of the governing council on April 25th, and on May 14th, he selected a piece of land on a peninsula that was located 40 miles from the Atlantic Ocean, and this would serve as a fortified settlement. When you're having your settlements, you always want to make sure that you close to natural resources and that you will be able to be fortified in any way. The prime reason for the locations as well is that it wasn't inhabited by native tribes in the area and it wasn't suitable for farming. They arrived too late to plant crops. Many of the men actually didn't know how to plant crops or to farm because they were of British nobility. In just a few months of the settlement, 80% of the colony had died and others ran off to the native nations in the area. The Powhatan Confederacy ruled in this area. They had settlements along the area and the numbered somewhere in the 14,000 people, consisted of 30 tribes. Chief Powhatan was their leader and they were Algonquin speaking. The territory extended from present-day Washington, D.C. near the Potomac River to the Albemarle Sound in South Carolina. At first, they welcomed the colonists with dancing and feasts and tobacco ceremonies, but then they were also weary of the colonists and feared that that the few that they had encountered would only grow in numbers. So they were a little suspicious. Like, okay, so we see a few of you, we're assuming more are going to come, and we're not sure if we necessarily like that. the first winter that the colony had was rough, but Powhatan didn't let the colony starve. Many of his people, including his 10-year-old daughter, Pocahontas, took the colony corn, fish, and wild game. The gifts were misunderstood by the colonists, and they were unappreciated. The colonists believed that the natives were paying tribute to the superiority of the Europeans. One of the colonists, George Percy, said that when the rations were dwindling down and they weren't going to be able to survive, the food from the natives saved them. He also thanked God who, quote, put terror in the savages' hearts to save the Europeans. In 1613, Pocahontas, who was the daughter of Chief Powhatan, was kidnapped by the English. She was held in captivity for well over a year, and it was during this time she converted to Christianity. In 1614, she marries a man by the name of John Rolfe. In 1616, she and Rolfe arrive in England, and she's basically shown off as a tamed savage. They dress her in English garb, she speaks English, all of that good stuff. In 1617, before they're able to come back to the colonies, Pocahontas becomes ill and she dies, never seeing her homelands again. In 1619, the English built a school for Native children to teach them Christianity. The English wanted the Native Americans to submit themselves to the Crown and to the Church of England, and they also wanted them to work for free, so basically slave labor. In 1620, there were over 1,000 colonists in Jamestown, and they asserted their superiority over the native peoples and laid land claim to the Powhatan Islands. So I think that's important to point out that during the founding of Jamestown, there were about 1,000 colonists. That population is going to come into play in a little bit later. So we also have Plymouth Rock, which this year is the 400th anniversary of the landing of Plymouth Rock. On December 21st, 1620, the Pilgrims who were on the Mayflower landed at Plymouth Rock. They settled on an abandoned settlement that was home to the Pequot tribe, part of the Wampanoag Confederacy, who had been devastated by a series of plagues, and they were virtually wiped out. The first formal contact with Native Americans in the area came on March 16th, 1621, when Samoset and Abenaki walked into their settlement and proclaimed in English, "Welcome, Englishmen." The Abenaki are an Algonquin-speaking tribe that calls New England and areas of Quebec home. They are one of 5 tribes of the Wabanaki Confederacy. During this visit, they learned that the leaders in the area were those of the Wampanoag tribe and that Massasoit was one of their chiefs. They also learned of Squanto, who was virtually the sole survivor of one of the plagues that wiped out one of the tribal villages. Samoset stayed the night in the settlement and agreed to arrange a meeting between the Pilgrims and Massasoit. Massasoit and Squanto were cautious of the Pilgrims because they didn't quite trust them. So this a theory of distrust between natives, indigenous people, and the U.S. government and settlers falls right before the founding of the United States anyway. So the distrust goes back a long ways. In Massasoit's first encounter with the English, several of his men had been killed by English sailors. And in the case of Squanto, he was actually kidnapped by the English and spent 5 years in England. So there was reason for that distrust. On March 22nd, Samoset returned to the settlement with a delegation of 60 warriors from Massasoit that included Squanto. Massasoit himself would join the delegation later on. He and the Pilgrims negotiated a peace agreement, and Squanto acted as the translator. Gifts were exchanged, with the Pilgrims giving Massasoit a pair of knives, a copper chain, biscuits, and, quote, a pot of strong water. In the peace agreement, both sides promised not to hurt each other, but instead to help each other if they were ever hit by a third-party attack. After the peace agreement was made, at the urging of Massasoit, Squanto acted as a diplomat, translator, and educator. He taught them how to farm in the area, fish, and how to gather supplies. In October of 1621, Massasoit invited the Pilgrims to join in a Wampanoag harvest ceremony. Part of this would later evolve into the first Thanksgiving, and there's lots of stories surrounding the first Thanksgiving. There's a lot of myth and actual history and timelines that all combine. But this was part of what would go into the myth of Thanksgiving as we know it. But the Pequot Wars end with a feast of celebration that is oftentimes known as the first Thanksgiving. And so just to tell you a little bit about the Pequot Wars, was a series of armed conflicts that ended up taking place between colonists in New England that were settled at Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay, Saybrook, and their allies, the Narragansett and Mohegan nations, on one side, and the Pequots on the other side. There was a series of events that would happen that would eventually lead to war in 1637. Beginning in the early 1630s, conflicts were arising. The Pequots and the Mohegans began to align themselves differently, the Pequot with the Dutch and the Mohegans with the English. The Massachusetts Bay Colony became a stronghold for wampum production, and wampum is a type of shell that is used in jewelry, in the creation of wampum belts, and it can only be found in the New England eastern coast area. So the Massachusetts Bay Colony became a stronghold for the wampum production, which the Pequot and the Narragansett had controlled until the mid-1630s. So you've got some economic issues coming into play now. 7 English privateers were murdered by a tribe in the area, and it was in response to the Dutch murdering a principal Pequot chief. They ended up saying that they didn't know the crewmen were English and they thought they were Dutch. There was also a demand for land in the Pequot-controlled areas such as Massachusetts and Connecticut. The areas in question were important because they controlled access to the Connecticut River and the rich valley that was right in that area. So in 1634, there was a group of unknown natives who killed slave hunter John Stone of Massachusetts and his 8 hunting companions. The Puritans then used his death to claim jurisdiction over the Pequot and all of their lands. The Pequots then attacked settlers in Connecticut on Pequot land. The governor of Massachusetts then organized a military to punish the Native Americans. On March 26, 1637, under the lead of Captain John Mason, 90 men, along with 200 Mohegans and Narragansetts, decided to launch a surprise attack and set fire to a Pequot settlement on the Mystic River. Over 700 men, women, and children were killed during that attack. The Connecticut laid claim to the Pequot land under the rights of conquest. Losing men eventually broke the spirits of the Pequot. They eventually decided to flee their lands and seek refuge in the west with the Mohawks. In mid-June, John Mason ended up catching up to those Pequots who escaped and surrounded them at present-day Fairfield, Connecticut. He would eventually allow a couple hundred to surrender, and this was mostly women and children that were surrendering. The Pequot leader at the time and around 8 of his warriors were able to sneak out, and they made it to New York, but instead of finding refuge with the Mohawks, they were killed instead. This was essentially the end of the Pequot War. Those who survived the war were sent to live with the Mohegans and the Narragansetts. Others were put on ships and sent to Bermuda as slaves. Many were made to work as servants in the English homes in the colony, and the colonies declared that the Pequots were now extinct and prohibited from ever using their name. So even if you were Pequot, you weren't allowed to say that you were Pequot. So that was virtually the end of the Pequot Nation. So then we flash forward to the American Revolution. And so it's very important to point out that by 1760, the population of the colonists reaches 1 million. So at the founding of Jamestown, you had about 1,000. And now we go to 1760, where the population reaches about 1 million. You have lots of things that happened. If you're not familiar with the lead into the American Revolution, there were things that happened. There was the Sugar Act and the Currency Act that was passed. There was the Stamp Act that was passed. There was the Boston Massacre that happened in 1770. There was then the Boston Tea Party that happened in 1773. And in 1774, the First Continental Congress meets and establishes a committee on Indian affairs and commits 40,000 pounds to Indian affairs. In 1775, the Second Continental Congress meets and establishes Indian commissioners, and Congress assumes central control over Native nations, not the states. So where you see a lot of times states have no control over the Native nations, it's because control is held at the federal level, and that was established in 1775. They created 3 departments of Indian affairs: the northern, southern, and middle, and each had their own Indian commissioner. In the north, the Indian commissioner was Benjamin Franklin, in the middle was Patrick Henry, and in the south was James Wilson. Franklin tried to negotiate neutrality in upcoming war by promising trade goods and blacksmith services. The offer was declined, but some did actually support the colonists. In 1777, like I said, the Iroquois Confederacy divides and eventually disperses over disagreements over who to support in the American Revolution. The Mohawks supported the British, the Onondaga and the Seneca favored neutrality, the Oneida and the Tuscarora sided with the colonists. In 1778, the first U.S. Indian treaty was signed with the Delaware, or the Lenape people. The treaty gave the Delaware the potential opportunity to send representatives to Congress in return for support for the colonies against the British. While this clause was never implemented, it did put the idea of Indian representation in Congress out there. And that has been written into other treaties, and some tribes have actually asserted that particular treaty right. The treaty also recognized the mechanism of it as a primary legal instrument for federal policy towards Native Americans. The first treaty between Native nations and the United States recognized the sovereignty of Native nations. And that's really important to point out. So the sovereignty of Native nations was originally recognized between this first treaty in 1778. So that puts us as sovereign entities. We are our own nations that can govern ourselves, and that is really put to light in 1778, and that's why we hold true to it today in 2020. So the Treaty of Greenville was also another really big treaty that happened during this time. It's also known as the Treaty with the Wyandots. This was a treaty that was signed in 1795 between the United States and the Native nations in the Northwest Territory after the Battle of Fallen Timbers. The treaty was signed on August 3rd, 1795, and essentially ended the Northwest Indian War in Ohio and determined that Indian country could be confined to the northwest part of Ohio. Those involved in the treaty were General Anthony Wayne, who is a huge name in the Detroit area. I'm from Detroit, so we know that name very well. William Wells, William Henry Harrison, William Clark, and Meriwether Lewis. The tribes involved were the Wyandot, the Delaware, the Shawnee, the Ottawa, the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, the Miami, and the Kickapoo. After the Battle of Fallen Timbers, the British agreed to withdraw their forts from the area. The treaty was meant to extinguish the Indian title to the lands that they had, which was about 2/3 of present-day Ohio, a section of Indiana, and the sites of present-day Detroit, Chicago, and Peoria. The map on here kind of shows the treaty line, because I'm not going to go into it. It's very, the land ceded is very long and difficult. So you can kind of see the treaty lines on there and where it kind of forced the Native Americans to. On instructions from the War Department, Wayne had all 1,100 chiefs sign the treaty individually. The Allied tribes gave up lands, but were also promised lands within a clear boundary, and promised that white settlement wouldn't happen on their new lands. So if you see this part of your territory, we're going to give you this part of the territory, and we're going to make sure it stays yours and that no one else comes on it. But the treaty also stipulated that lands could only be ceded by the whole tribe, not individuals. They also had the right to all remaining lands that had not been ceded for white settlement. Acting on orders from Jefferson, William Henry Harrison, who had been appointed governor of the Northwest Territory, violated the treaty almost immediately after it was signed. The ink was barely dry. As with any treaty, lands were being encroached upon by white settlers and violated treaty agreements. An upset Tecumseh would lead a group of natives into reforming their own confederacy to regain their land. This would all come to a head at the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811, where they would lose overwhelmingly, and this is said to have driven the tribes to support the British during the War of 1812. After the War of 1812, native tribes were continuously moved westward to Indian country west of the Mississippi. By 1840, the old Northwest Territory was essentially cleared of any native presence. And then we also moved to 1820, where the population now reaches 20 million people. We went from 1,000 at Jamestown to 1 million at the start of the Revolution to now 20 million by 1820. So it grows. And this all leads into where we're actually going to stop this lecture for today, which is Indian Removal Act. The Indian Removal Act was signed into law by President Andrew Jackson on May 28, 1830. What it did is it authorized the president to grant unsettled lands west of the Mississippi to Native Americans if they gave up their lands east of the Mississippi that were already in were already formed in states, existing states. There was a period of voluntary migration where some tribes did move, but there were also tribes that did not want to move. The Choctaws were the first to sign a treaty, and they started to move west, but some stayed behind. And that happened with a lot of the tribes. Even if they signed treaties, some always stayed behind. The Seminoles were coerced into signing a removal treaty. Many refused to leave, and that led to the Second Seminole War. The Creeks refused to leave, but signed a treaty that would guarantee them protector rights over their land, but it didn't stop them from speculators. So in 1836, the Creeks were forcibly removed from their homelands. The Chickasaws saw the move as inevitable and did not resist removal. They signed a treaty with the federal government for suitable land in the West and protection until they moved. However, white settlers were too much for the federal government to handle, and they backed out of that treaty. The Chickasaw were forced to pay the Choctaws for the right to live on part of their allotment. In 1831, the Cherokee decided they were not going to leave, and they were going to use everything that they had at their disposal to stop being moved. And they thought because they had assimilated themselves so much that they were going to be able to stay. The Cherokees were unique in the fact that they did a lot to kind of push off being removed. They learned English. They had their children learn English. They converted to Christianity. They formed schools where their children were educated. They had their Cherokee language written down and had a dictionary. They had a newspaper. And in a lot of other cases, if they were able to, they had plantations and owned slaves. They civilized themselves, quote unquote, to hopefully stop removal. But that didn't stop removal. It didn't matter because at the end of the day, we were still considered an Indian. So in 1831, what the Cherokee decided to do is that they were going to take their case all the way to the Supreme Court in Worcester versus Georgia. They used a Georgia law that stated white settlers couldn't live on Indian land without written permission from the state. And since that had not happened, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Cherokee, stating that they had the right to self-govern themselves. The state, though, refused to enforce the law, and President Jackson refused to uphold the decision of the Supreme Court. So the Cherokees, after winning the Supreme Court case, were forced into signing a treaty of removal. Jackson had obtained the signature of a Cherokee chief agreeing to relocation. The Cherokees were given just 2 years to voluntarily move. But by 1838, 16,000 remained on their land and they refused to leave. So what does Jackson do? He sends in 7,000 U.S. military troops that were armed to force the Cherokee to move at gunpoint. They were not allowed to gather any of their belongings. Basically, what they had on is what they took with them. They were forced into stockades to wait removal. And as they were forced into these stockades, white settlers came in and they saw their homes being looted. They would get ready for travel. And this would become known as the Trail of Tears. Along the way, 4,000 Native Americans died of disease, cold, and hunger. By the 1840s, with the exception of a small band of Seminoles, no tribes resided in the South from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. A total of 50,000 Native Americans were moved off their lands. And what does this do? This opens up 25 million acres of land to white settlers and to the spread of slavery. And in the midst of all of this, in 1836, Arkansas becomes a state. By 1860, the population of the United States reaches 60 million people. The native population at the total in 1860 is just under 340,000. So we once ruled this continent, we once roamed freely, once had our homes here, And by 1860, our numbers are just under 340,000 people. And that is unbelievable. So I think it's very important to note that. I want to leave you with some suggested readings. An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz is a book that I love to recommend to a lot of people. I think it's a great read. If you're familiar with Howard Zinn's A People History of the United States, this book is similar in the sense that it doesn't sugarcoat the history, it tells it like it is, and this is told from an Indigenous perspective. Native History by Judith Nyes is a book that is done in like a timeline form, and it has world history on one side and Native history on the other, so you can see what's happening side by side around the world in the United States, as well as what's happening with Native history at the same time. Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee is a book by Dee Brown that talks about the story of the West in the United States and how it was won or not won, so to speak, but through Indigenous eyes. The Library of Congress's website is a great source to look up literature on interactions with Native people, and then I would also encourage you to visit the National Archives site at the same time, where they just digitized over 300 treaties from the United States and Native nations. So you can go on there and you can read them and you can look them up by different tribes. It's very interesting. I've played on that website a little bit and there's a lot of great information. If you are into documentaries, I would recommend that you watch 100 Years. You can find this on Netflix, and this is the story of Eloise Cobell, who was a Blackfoot woman, member of Blackfeet tribe in Montana, and she is instrumental in having a huge amount of money restored back to Native people whose lands were being leased or rented for to gain the natural resources that were there. This was a case when she discovered the discrepancy of payments being made. It happened in the 1990s, and the case actually wasn't then settled until the first year of President Obama's administration. And so it goes through the whole story about her commitment to financial literacy amongst Native nations and her work that she did. And then the last documentary I would leave you with is called Trudel, and you can actually watch this on either Netflix or Amazon Prime. And it is about one of my most favorite Native activists, John Trudel, and it goes through his story. He's an activist, he's an artist, he's a poet, he's everything, and it talks about a lot of his work through his eyes, through his story. Any of the books that I have recommended on here, I encourage you to support small and support local during this time. Support your local library if they have these books, and your local bookstores. Order them from there and not those big box stores right now. Let's just support local as much as we can. And that is what I have for you, and I really appreciate being invited to do this. Hopefully I can come back and speak with you all again soon, and thank you very much, and thank you to the Irvington Public Library for having me.
Heather, thank you so much. I'm just going to ask you to, actually I can do it over here, stop the sharing. Okay, so Heather, I just wanted to mention in regards to a couple of those books, Native American History and Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee are available through the Westchester Library System for our patrons. We're going to have to look into getting a copy of that other one. And rather, an Indigenous Peoples History of the United States is available. Native American History is not. We also have access to streaming video of 100 Years through the Canopy app. Westchester Library System cardholders can sign up for Canopy at wls.canopy.com. That's Canopy with a K instead of a C. You'll have to provide some information related to your library account, including your PIN, which is usually the last 4 digits of your phone number in case you forgot that one. Thanks to everyone for joining us today, and for everyone who's watching the recording of this video. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now, unless, Heather, do you have any other final comments?
I don't. Again, thank you so much for having me. Hope I can come back and virtually speak with you guys again, and I appreciate it.
All right, great. So we're going to stop the recording.